Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world where the largest animal alive today, the blue whale, the largest creature ever known to have existed, would look almost modest standing beside something that walked on land. A world where the sky above you was patrolled by creatures with wingspans wider than a fighter jet, where the air itself smelled different, where the oxygen content of the atmosphere rewrote the rules of biology. A world that existed not in fiction, but here, on this planet, on these continents. That world was real. It lasted for 165 million years, and almost everything we thought we knew about it, the way it looked, the way it sounded, the way it functioned, was wrong. We called them terrible lizards. That was the first mistake, because they were not lizards, and terrible does not begin to describe what they actually were. The dinosaurs were not the lumbering, cold-blooded, gray-skinned reptilian failures that a century of popular imagination made them. They were, in the most rigorous scientific sense, extraordinary, biologically unprecedented, evolutionarily brilliant. And the story of how we got them so wrong, and how we are now correcting that story in real time, is one of the most gripping scientific revolutions of our era. What you are about to hear is not the story of dinosaurs as monsters. It is the story of dinosaurs as living, breathing, warm, fast, colorful, intelligent, socially complex animals. Animals that dominated this planet longer than any other group of large creatures before or since. Animals whose descendants are, right now, landing on your windowsill and singing outside your window every morning. Because here is the truth. The dinosaurs never went extinct. Let that sit for a moment. The real story begins not with their death. It begins with understanding how extraordinary their life actually was. In 1842, a British anatomist named Richard Owen looked at 3 sets of fossil bones that had been recovered from English limestone and made a decision that would shape the next 2 centuries of scientific thinking. He decided these creatures needed a name. He called them Dinosauria, from the Greek deinos, meaning fearfully great, and sauros, meaning lizard. It was a reasonable interpretation for the time. The bones were enormous, they were reptilian in appearance, and in the 19th century, the dominant framework for understanding prehistory was that evolution moved in a straight line from primitive to advanced, from cold-blooded and slow to warm-blooded and fast. Reptiles occupied the primitive end of that spectrum. Mammals occupied the sophisticated end. Dinosaurs in this framework were simply very large, very old reptiles, failed experiments, evolutionary dead ends cleared away by a catastrophe to make room for superior creatures, namely us.
Sauropod dinosaur bones were up to 60% hollow. What was the main advantage of this?
This interpretation was not just wrong, it was precisely backwards. The paradox that paleontologists began to confront in the latter half of the 20th century was this. If dinosaurs were such evolutionary failures, why did they dominate the planet for 165 million years? Homo sapiens have existed for roughly 300,000 years. Our entire species history, from the first anatomically modern human to right now, fits inside a sliver barely visible on the geological timeline that dinosaurs occupied. Something that fails does not persist for 165 million years. Something that fails does not produce body plans sophisticated enough to achieve sizes that have never been replicated by any land animal before or since. Something that fails does not, after an extinction event of literally apocalyptic proportions, leave behind 10,000 living species that continue to thrive today. The central mystery paleontologists began pursuing in earnest in the 1960s and 1970s was not why did dinosaurs fail? It was why were they so extraordinarily successful? And what they found when they started digging, literally and figuratively, overturned nearly everything that had been assumed. It started with a bone. More specifically, it started with what was inside a bone. In the late 1960s, a paleontologist named John Ostrom was studying the fossil of a small, swift, predatory dinosaur found in Montana. The animal was called Deinonychus, terrible claw, and it was nothing like the sluggish giant reptiles that dominated the popular imagination. It was lean, it was built for speed. Its skeletal structure suggested a level of agility that no cold-blooded reptile could sustain, and it appeared to have hunted in coordinated groups. Ostrom published a paper in 1969 that quietly, without fanfare, detonated a bomb underneath a century of assumptions. He argued that dinosaurs were not cold-blooded at all. He argued they were physiologically closer to birds than to any living reptile. He argued that the metabolic complexity required to produce the behaviors and body plans he was observing was inconsistent with ectothermy, the technical term for cold-bloodedness, and demanded something closer to endothermy, warm-bloodedness. The scientific community was skeptical. Then, the evidence began to accumulate.
Birds are technically dinosaurs. Which feature proves this connection most directly?
To understand why the warm-blooded debate matters, you need to understand what metabolism actually does. Metabolism is not just the process by which an animal converts food into energy. It is the master clock that governs how fast an animal lives, how active it can be, how rapidly it can respond to threats, how quickly it can grow, and how much cognitive complexity it can sustain. Cold-blooded animals, ectotherms, are at the mercy of their environment. When it is warm, they are fast. When it is cold, they slow down. They require far less food, which is metabolically efficient, but they are physiologically constrained. A lizard sitting on a rock in the sun can sprint impressively for a few seconds. It cannot maintain that sprint for long. It cannot hunt in the cold. It cannot forage at night with the same effectiveness as a warm-blooded predator. Its brain operates within a narrower envelope. Warm-blooded animals, endotherms, generate their own heat internally. They can sustain activity across a far wider range of conditions. They can maintain consistent performance regardless of ambient temperature. They can grow faster. Their brains can support greater complexity. The trade-off is caloric cost. A warm-blooded animal must eat far more than a cold-blooded animal of similar size. But the payoff, in terms of behavioral flexibility and ecological range, is enormous. If dinosaurs were warm-blooded, that changed everything about how we understood their ecology, their behavior, their geographic distribution, and their evolutionary success. The evidence that began to emerge in the 1980s and 1990s came from multiple independent directions simultaneously. Bone histology, the microscopic study of bone structure, revealed growth rings and tissue organization in dinosaur bones that closely resembled those of fast-growing warm-blooded animals, not the slow-growing cold-blooded pattern seen in modern reptiles. A 2012 study published in Nature by paleobiologist Roger Seymour calculated from cardiovascular data that the blood pressure required to sustain the brain of a large sauropod dinosaur could only have been generated by a four-chambered heart, the same kind of heart found in birds and mammals, not the three-chambered heart of most reptiles. This was not a subtle hint. It was a direct architectural requirement of the biology. Then came the discovery that would, more than any other, force the scientific consensus to shift completely. Feathers. The feather revolution. In 1996, quarry workers in Liaoning province in northeastern China cracked open a piece of shale and found something that would rewrite the textbooks. They found a small dinosaur, roughly the size of a chicken, with clear, unambiguous evidence of feathers preserved in the rock. The animal was named Sinosauropteryx, the Chinese dragon bird, and it was a non-avian dinosaur, not a bird, a dinosaur with feathers. Over the following 2 decades, Liaoning and similar fossil beds produced an extraordinary parade of feathered dinosaurs: Microraptor with 4 wings, Anchiornis with elaborate plumage across its entire body, Yuanshuavis with a tail fan of complex feathers. These were not birds, they were members of the same evolutionary lineage as Tyrannosaurus rex, preserved in exquisite detail at a critical moment in the transition between non-avian dinosaurs and modern birds. Feathers, for most of evolutionary history, had nothing to do with flight. The earliest feathers were insulating structures. They were filamentous coverings that trapped warm air close to the body, exactly the kind of structure you would expect in an animal generating its own body heat and needing to retain it. The discovery that feathers predated flight,
that they existed across multiple lineages of non-avian dinosaurs provided direct physical evidence of endothermic physiology in the dinosaurian lineage reaching back well before the emergence of birds. A 2012 study published in Nature by a team from University College Cork used optical analysis to examine melanosomes, the microscopic structures responsible for color, preserved in fossil feathers and skin. What they found was staggering. Dinosaurs were not gray. They were not uniformly brown or dull. They were, in many cases, brilliantly and specifically colored. Sinosauropteryx had a striped reddish-brown tail. Microraptor's feathers contained evidence of iridescent glossy black coloration similar to modern crows. Psittacosaurus, a plant-eating dinosaur, had countershading, darker on top, lighter below, exactly like a modern deer, indicating sophisticated camouflage adapted to specific light environments. The visual world of the Mesozoic was not a gray-brown fog of slow reptilian shapes. It was vivid, it was colored, it was socially signaled, because color in animals almost always serves communication functions, from mate attraction to territorial display to predator warning. A world of colorful dinosaurs is a world of socially complex dinosaurs. Size, physics, and the architecture of giants. Now consider the question of size. How does an animal get to the size of a blue whale while living on land? How does the engineering of a body actually work when you are pushing against the fundamental limits of terrestrial biology? The largest dinosaurs, the Titanosaur sauropods, the long-necked giants that formed the popular image of Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus, were not simply larger versions of normal animals. They were structurally reimagined organisms, built on different engineering principles than any large mammal. Consider the skeleton. A large mammal's bones are dense and solid because mammals evolved from small ancestors and scaled up their skeletal architecture incrementally. A large sauropod's bones were pneumatized, filled with air sacs connected to the respiratory system, hollow in ways that drastically reduced weight without sacrificing structural integrity. A 2011 study published in the journal PLOS One calculated that pneumatization reduced the skeletal mass of large sauropods by roughly 60% compared to a mammal of equivalent size. Without this adaptation, the largest sauropods could not have stood up. Their bone architecture was not reptilian. It was closer to a modern bird, light, hollow, and air-filled. The respiratory system that fed those air sacs was itself a marvel. Modern birds, and the evidence now strongly suggests, large dinosaurs, use a flow-through respiratory system quite unlike the tidal breathing of mammals. Where a mammal's lung fills and empties like a bellows, a bird's lung maintains a unidirectional flow of air through a complex of air sacs that keep fresh, oxygen-rich air moving across the gas exchange surface continuously, even during exhalation. This system extracts oxygen from air with dramatically greater efficiency than mammalian lungs. At high altitudes or during intense physical activity, this respiratory advantage is enormous. It is why birds can fly at altitudes where mammals would be incapacitated. And if this system existed in non-avian dinosaurs, which the pneumatized bones strongly suggested did, it helps explain how animals of such extraordinary size could sustain the metabolic demands of active, warm-blooded physiology. The neck of a large sauropod was an engineering problem of its own. A giraffatitan had a neck that could extend 8 meters or more. Moving blood from the heart to the brain at that distance requires extraordinary cardiovascular pressure. Studies of the cardiovascular physics involved suggest heart masses proportionally far larger than any living terrestrial mammal, and blood pressure regulation mechanisms that remain poorly understood, but point towards a level of physiological sophistication entirely inconsistent with the primitive reptile model. Then came the discovery that would, more than any other, force the scientific consensus to shift completely. For most of the history of dinosaur science, the assumption was that non-avian dinosaurs were behaviorally simple: feed, reproduce, avoid predators. The more complex behaviors, pair bonding, parental care, cooperative hunting, play, were considered the exclusive domain of mammals and birds. That assumption has not survived scrutiny. Evidence of parental care in dinosaurs is now extensive. Clutches of fossilized eggs found in the Gobi Desert in the 1990s revealed that Oviraptor, whose name, meaning egg thief, was based on a spectacularly wrong early interpretation, died sitting on its own nest in the brooding posture identical to that of modern birds. Maiasarosaurus, a large herbivorous dinosaur of the late Cretaceous in what is now Montana, raised its young in structured colonial nesting grounds, with evidence that adults actively fed juveniles too small to feed themselves, a level of parental investment previously thought impossible in non-avian dinosaurs. The evidence for complex social behavior in predatory dinosaurs is subtler but increasingly compelling. The discovery of multiple Deinonychus associated with a large prey animal, a large ornithopod called Tenontosaurus, was initially interpreted as evidence of pack hunting. Some researchers have since questioned whether this represents coordinated hunting or opportunistic aggregation, but the debate itself illustrates the point. We are now asking questions about dinosaur cognition and social organization that would have seemed absurd to an earlier generation of paleontologists. Bain endocasts, internal molds of the brain cavity, revealed that many theropod dinosaurs had brain-to-body ratios substantially higher than those of modern crocodilians and large reptiles. Troodon, a small predatory dinosaur of
Here is the deepest truth that the last 50 years of paleontology has uncovered, and it is one that requires a genuine shift in perspective to fully absorb. The story we told about dinosaurs was never really about dinosaurs. It was about us. When 19th century scientists looked at dinosaur fossils and saw failed, primitive, cold-blooded reptiles swept away to make room for the sophisticated mammals that would eventually produce humanity, they were not reading the fossil record. They were projecting a narrative onto it, a narrative in which evolution has a direction, in which complexity increases linearly, in which human beings, warm-blooded, large-brained, socially complex, represent the culmination of a billion-year upward arc. In this story, dinosaurs were a necessary failure, a wrong turn, a lesson in what happens when evolution does not produce the right kind of animal. The fossil record does not support this story at all. Dinosaurs did not fail. They thrived with extraordinary success for a period of time so vast that it renders human civilization microscopic by comparison. When the asteroid struck the Yucatan Peninsula 66 million years ago, releasing energy equivalent to roughly 10 billion Hiroshima-scale nuclear detonations, sending a global winter across the planet within weeks, collapsing the food chains that sustained large-bodied life, it was not a judgment on dinosaurian inadequacy. It was an event of such severity that it would have eliminated any lineage of large-bodied organisms regardless of their sophistication. The mammals that survived were not survivors because they were superior. They were survivors because they were small, because they were burrowers, because their metabolic flexibility and their modest caloric needs allowed them to persist on the depauperate ecosystem that remained after the impact winter. And yet, here is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary. The dinosaurs survived too. 10,000 species of them in every ecosystem on Earth. With the exception of the largest body sizes, the diversity of form and ecological function that dinosaurs achieved before the end Cretaceous extinction event has been substantially recreated by the avian lineage in the 66 million years since. The hummingbird is as much a dinosaur as Brachiosaurus was. The albatross, ranging across the open ocean for years without touching land, is a dinosaur. The ostrich, which cannot fly but runs faster than a horse, is a dinosaur. The penguin, which has traded flight for aquatic propulsion and can dive deeper than 200 meters, is a dinosaur. The dinosaurs did not lose, they adapted. And the branch of their lineage that survived the asteroid impact went on to become the most species-rich class of terrestrial vertebrates on the planet today. What the revolution in dinosaur science represents at its deepest level is a lesson in epistemology, in how human assumptions shape what we see when we look at evidence. For a century,
We looked at the same bones and saw failures. Then, scientists began questioning the assumptions embedded in how they were looking, and the bones began to tell a completely different story. A story not of failure, but of unparalleled success. A story not of primitive cold-bloodedness, but of sophisticated, warm, colorful, complex animals whose lineage never ended. There is a bird outside almost every window in the world right now. If you live in a city, it is probably a pigeon, or a sparrow, or a starling. If you live near a coast, perhaps a gull. If you are fortunate, a hawk or an owl. Whatever it is, it carries within its genome the record of 230 million years of dinosaurian evolution. Its hollow bones, its four-chambered heart, its flow-through respiratory system, its feathers, these are not new inventions. They are ancient ones, refined and perfected over an expanse of time that we genuinely struggle to hold in the mind. The lesson of dinosaur science is not simply that we got the facts wrong. Facts are correctable. The deeper lesson is that the stories we tell about the past are almost always stories about the present, about what we value, about what we consider success, about where we imagine we stand in the hierarchy of living things. When we told the story of dinosaurs as failures, we were telling a story about human exceptionalism, about the inevitability of our kind of intelligence, our kind of complexity, our kind of consciousness. The revised story of dinosaurs as extraordinary, warm, colorful, complex animals whose lineage never ended is more humbling. It places us within a continuous, branching, non-linear process of evolution that has no destination, no direction, no preference for any particular outcome. We are not the point of the story. We are a character in it, and the story is still going. The Mesozoic world ended not because it was inferior, but because a rock traveling at 30 kilometers per second happened to intersect with the orbit of Earth at a particular moment in geological time. Random, arbitrary, unrelated to the fitness or sophistication of any organism alive at that moment. The survivors were not the best. They were the ones whose particular combination of traits happened to be compatible with survival in an ecological catastrophe of unimaginable severity. We are here because of those survivors. The small, warm-blooded, furry creatures that hid in burrows while the sky rained fire were our ancestors. But the 10,000 species of dinosaurs alive today, the birds, are not our poor relations. They are the surviving branch of a lineage that dominated this planet with a success we have not yet equaled and may never. The terrible lizards were never lizards, and there was nothing terrible about them. They were magnificent. They were complex. They were alive in ways we are only beginning to understand. And in a very real sense, in every forest, in every wetland, in every backyard and city park and open ocean, they still are.